Welcome to another of our worldwide WiSH webinars hosted this Wednesday, a very exciting one where we welcome really someone who's world famous, which is always great for us. And I'm very delighted to have some co-presenters who will introduce our guest in a couple of minutes. And those presenters are the chair of the WiSH Running Interest Group, Belinda Waghorn, who you've heard on these webinars before. Belinda has been very active in managing this group, and it's been really one of the success stories of WiSH. So I'll take this opportunity to thank you, Belinda, for what you've done and for the enthusiasm that you've brought to this group and to running in WiSH. And a very warm welcome from WITS and WITS Sport and Health to Lindsay Parry, a household name in running and endurance sport, not only in Gauteng, but in South Africa. I think somebody who's really been able to reach out using technology to runners all over the country, and I'm sure around the world. So, Lindsay, we're really grateful to have your insights today in this running webinar. And I'll look to Belinda to introduce our guest speaker. But just a big thank you again to the sponsors of the WiSH webinars, the Lito and Asina Pharmaceutical Group, manufacturers of Zepho, one of the anti-inflammatories which we commonly use in our athletes. So without them, we wouldn't be able to put the technical aspects together for this, and we're very grateful for them supporting WiSH. Also to Dr. Robin Saggers, always there in the background, doing all the technical work and promotional work, together with our social media team. We're very grateful to have your support as well. I think by now we've done over 30 of these. You know how they work. Use the question and answer panel to ask your questions rather than the chat group. We welcome your comments on the chat group, but for question and answer, please type them in. And this is probably a once in a lifetime opportunity to give our guest speaker these sort of questions. So please do fire away and don't feel shy. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Belinda to introduce this webinar and our guest speaker, and I'm going to fade into the background as she and Lindsay take over for the rest of the webinar. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy it.
Thanks for that, John, and thanks for the introduction. And again, welcome to everyone to this evening's WiSH webinar on exercise training. As we all know, running is significantly influenced by our lifestyle factors, which include our training schedules, running shoes, food, and virtually all types of stress. So of utmost importance is that athletes remain both healthy and fit. To a great extent, this can be accomplished by balancing one's lifestyle to help promote better performance, prevent injuries, and hormone imbalances, and improve the longevity of a runner's career. This presentation tonight by Dr. Maffetone will explain how this can be achieved. Now, although I have not had the privilege of actually meeting Dr. Maffetone in person, albeit over Zoom this evening, since he's not yet been to South Africa, but I am working on that at the moment. I have read some of his books and follow his training principles, and have done for some time now, and often advise my patients to do the same. However, it requires discipline and patience, which, as we know, very few runners actually possess. Now, as one can expect from over 40 years of experience, Dr. Maffetone has a very impressive CV. He's qualified in human biology, physiotherapy, chiropractics, kinesiology, and Chinese medicine. And by qualified, I mean he has doctorates and postdoctoral qualifications in these fields. He has won numerous awards and has published countless books and academic articles. He's currently a consultant to sports teams, corporates, professional athletes, and professional musicians. He's an author and lecturer to the general public, professionals, corporates, on topics which include health and fitness, diet and nutrition, lifestyle and stress management, and EEG type and EMG type biofeedback. He's the founder of Maf Fitness and Maf Medical in Sydney, Australia, and currently lectures CME courses which are accredited by the University of West Virginia. Dr. Maffetone, besides being highly qualified in his field, has running experience that began when he was in high school and college, and later on ended up with him running longer distances and participating in events up to the marathon distance and duathlons and triathlons. Currently, he's taken up some hiking to give him a bit of a rest from the running due to an injury. However, he has assured me that as soon as he is healed up, he will be training for comrades. Dr. Maffetone also travels internationally as a singer-songwriter, so he's clearly a man of many talents. With that, over to you, Dr. Maffetone, and welcome and thank you so much for giving us time this evening to present this to us.
Thanks so much, Belinda and John. Thank you. And for all others who helped put this program together for today, and all of you for showing up. This is a real honor. Exercise training, of course, is a lifestyle issue. All of our lifestyle factors influence our training and exercise performance as in the rest of our life. And they sort of influence each other. We have this cycle of lifestyle that affects all of our other lifestyle factors. And of course, these include our training schedules, the weather, the foods we eat during and in between training, hydration, and virtually all stress. And remember, we need to look at stress in a more holistic way. It's not just mental, emotional stress, but physical stress and biochemical stress as well. Very, very important lifestyle factors to consider. For example, physical stress, of course, includes our training, but more importantly, things like shoes. Without proper fit, shoes can create a significant stress. It's a mechanical stress. Biochemical stress is a common one as well. It's not just internal and external air pollution, but the foods we eat and how they affect us metabolically that potentially can improve or increase stress responses in the body. Of course, mental, emotional stress is something we're familiar with, but I want to mention one important component relative to what we're doing here, and that's misinformation. Misinformation is it's just a common stress. The media promotes it. We have a society full of trends, the no pain, no gain trend, as an example, which has been ongoing for decades, actually hundreds of years. And we tend to follow these trends blindly without using the logic that we need to focus on to control our lifestyle and improve our running, among other things. One interesting thing about humans is, as we all know, we're all uniquely different. All runners are different, all people are different. And while that's obvious, society comes up with these cookbook trendy ideas that say we should all be doing this and we should all be doing that. The diet ideas that come out in books seemingly every day, and the running programs that we are all exposed to on a regular basis. And we're told, or we think sometimes these programs are ones we should all follow to be better athletes. They appear in magazines, and whenever there's a quote from a great winner of a marathon, hey, how did you get to be so good? Well, I run this many miles a week. Oh, okay, so now everyone says I should run that many miles a week. Unfortunately, age group athletes in particular try to emulate this, and it's a common reason for overtraining that is associated with injury and illness and ongoing poor performance. If we look at the times over the years in the age group running community, times have been slowing down for many, many years. We do see improving times in the front of the pack runners, and after that, it's a sad situation, and poor health and poor fitness certainly are the reasons for that. I remember years ago hearing from some athletes I was working with about a published article about the Kenyans and what they ate for breakfast growing up, and many athletes said, "Gee, I'm gonna try eating that same meal," as if magically it'll transform them into a world-class athlete. Of course, it doesn't. I've always promoted the notion that athletes should strive to be both healthy and fit. That's a very important philosophy. I think I felt that. I started putting it into words even as an undergraduate student. And I've defined health as a state where all of our systems in the body are balanced. Our muscles, the nervous system, hormones, the gut, and so forth. We don't achieve perfect balance, but we can keep striving for it. We can keep tweaking our lifestyle to get healthier along the way. And certainly as we age, we have to tweak things because our body changes, and therefore our response to lifestyle factors should change as well. Fitness, I define as simply our athletic ability. The first place finisher in a race is more fit than the runner-up, at least for that race. And again, the game is for us to all reach our athletic potential, which we do by removing those roadblocks that interfere with health and fitness. So it all goes together, and it's really sad that we still, now in 2020, we still see too many athletes who are fit but unhealthy. Lifestyle significantly influences all of this, and we have significant control over lifestyle. So we affect our health and fitness more than our genes. Sure, our genes are an important factor, obviously, in sports and in health, but our lifestyle also controls the expression of many of these genes, and that's an important factor. One of the ways I've learned to help runners accomplish their goals is to emphasize personalization. It's what we need to do to develop our natural talent, because we are so different. And we need to look at this, again, holistically, because if we only look at our running schedules and think, this is what I have to do, and we forget about the rest of our world, we can get into trouble. One way I've helped athletes do this is with biofeedback, which is a broad term that we can apply to many aspects of the human body. But in this case, specifically, monitoring the exercise intensity using a heart rate monitor. And I'll come back to this in a moment. MAF, as you've seen me talk about on my website and some of the literature you've gotten, MAF stands for maximum aerobic function. And it's a key focus for me and for this approach. It's a key component of becoming healthier and fit. It's an important factor common in human physiology. And specifically, it's the high rate of fat oxidation, which generates large amounts of energy, and not unlike other animals. We convert fat to ATP very well, at least when we have the right metabolism. And one of the references you have in your notes is a paper in Frontiers Exercise Physiology called Maximum Aerobic Function. And you can see that title here. And I want to I want to read the very first line. I'm sorry to quote myself, but this is a paper that Professor Paul Larson and I wrote, published earlier this year. And this first line really says a lot. And it goes, the earliest humans relied on large quantities of metabolic energy from the oxidation of fatty acids to develop larger brains and bodies, prevent and reduce disease risk, extend longevity, in addition to other benefits. This was a huge point in human evolutions. We didn't have the large brains and the bigger bodies to survive as much, and this was a huge change for us. And this energy we obtained from fat oxidation supports our daily life. We didn't just use it to build better brains, but we felt we built a brain that was incredible and amazing as we know today. And this energy supported everyday life. You know, we went about our day with prolonged low intensity aerobic based physical activity. It also supported our sympathetic nervous system when, if we had to sprint, for example, to escape danger, we were able to do that. And we can still do that today. Any one of us, almost every one of us can go out and sprint to the mailbox or to our car if we have to get something quickly, whether we've trained to do that or not. These human characteristics are supported in great part through our human diet. And in the beginning, predominantly that diet was high fat, some protein, and very little carbohydrate. Only relatively recently has that radically changed in the last 5,000 years, following the changes that the agricultural revolution brought about. Junk food was born, basically. We started processing carbohydrates in particular. And today, unfortunately, most of the world eats a very high carbohydrate, one that's refined for the most part, diet with much less fat and protein. Of course, the optimal balance of these macronutrients is somewhat individual. However, when we have an imbalance in these macronutrients, we can suffer the consequences. It's easy to know when this happens because we develop abnormal signs and symptoms. Fatigue, injuries, hunger, poor performance. Sure, other factors in our lifestyle influence these problems, but diet plays a significant role. And here's a great example. Humans now face one of their greatest problems, a pandemic, that of overfat. We are in the midst of a overfat pandemic that has been ongoing for decades. And I've defined overfat as excess body fat that impairs health and fitness. And it's a primary problem. Overfat also affects many runners and other athletes, both professional and age group. Just go to any local sporting event, watch sports on TV, and it'll appear obvious. Although sometimes it's deceptive, as high numbers of normal weight, non-obese individuals still can have excess body fat. Actually, a fairly high number, upwards of 40% or more. From this model, we see that 80 to 90% of the world is over fat. In the US, it's 91%, a paper I wrote 2 or 3 years ago with the latest data. In India, 80% of adults are over fat. that's just astounding. It still amazes me today because we think of India as a country that is full of people starving and malnourished, and they're still there. But 80% of Indians are overfat. South Africa, I think it's 80% or more, although the overfat prevalence has not been determined in South Africa, but it would be easy research to do if anyone's game for that. And I have a line from one of my overfat papers that goes something like, for the first time in human history, the number of obese people is higher than those who are underweight. I've met too many athletes, some professionals, again, mostly amateurs, who could no longer compete. They could no longer compete successfully due to being overfat. And some of them are obese. These are preventable problems for the most part. Determining overfat in a research setting is done through DEXA, DEXA and other technologies, which are really not available to the average person. So for the rest of the world, we have a very simple at-home test we can perform. It's called the waist to height ratio. We measure our waist at the level of the umbilicus, and our waist should be less than half our height. Otherwise, we're considered overfat. It's a very accurate evaluation, as simple as it may seem. You could look at some of my overfat articles to see what references there are out there on that. But some of you may remember all the measurements that have been researched and recommended over the years, waist to hip ratio in particular, and other measurements. And this one, I think, has replaced all those other ones as being the most accurate. Just a note of caution. You may not be as tall as you think you are. We many of us have our height on our driver's license, and we said when we were 16 years of age or whatever, well, I'm this height now, but in another year I'll be that height, and so we use that height. And I'm amazed at how many people actually are not as tall as they say or as they think. So measure yourself once, and just if you want to cheat a little bit, measure your height in the morning because you're a touch taller, and that'll help your waist to height ratio just a bit. The condition of overfat is, if we drill down to what specifically is going on, overfat promotes chronic inflammation. And the trickle-down effect continues on to chronic disease, physical disability, including common injuries, and obviously pain is a big part of that, and also increased risk for infection as overfat impairs the immune system. And I have a paper that was on COVID and called The Perfect Storm, the combined COVID pandemic and overfat pandemic, and how relevant that is, showing that the people who were getting sick and the people who were dying were people who were overfat primarily. And again, I can't emphasize enough that so many of these problems are preventable. And in the case of the pandemic, it's a way we can prevent the next pandemic. How can so many people become overfat? Well, I've already alluded to that, and it's that most of the world eats a high refined carbohydrate diet. And normally about 40% or up to 50% in people who are more insulin resistant of the carbohydrates we consume, excluding fiber, 40 to 50% of those carbohydrates is converted to fat for storage. And when we talk about fat burning, we're talking about taking that fat out of storage, converting it to ATP for energy. Of course, if we don't burn a lot of fat, it stays in storage. And insulin, of course, is the hormone responsible for that. So insulin not only stores this fat, but insulin will prevent us from fat burning, even if we're doing all the right things in training. Excess body fat impairs athletic performance a number of ways. The associated weight gain is one. Poor metabolism, reduced fat burning is one. Therefore, we have to shift reliance for energy on glucose. And in a long race, even a 10K, that's a problem. Certainly in a marathon or in an ultra marathon, we just don't have enough carbohydrate to last those distances. And general associated health problems, especially those related to chronic inflammation, which is a lot of them. When we are chronically inflamed, we just don't physically, biochemically, and mental, emotionally work properly. So I want to talk about something called the MAF heart rate. In addition to food, training significantly impacts fat oxidation. Perhaps the most important training factor is intensity. Intensity is directly related to the mix of fuels, sugar, glucose, and fat that we use every day during rest and during physical activity. And when we look at the energy generated during training, for example, we see typically a certain balance of this glucose and fat, and as exercise intensity rises, fat oxidation reduces, glucose rises. However, a runner with good metabolism still burns a relatively high amount of fat even during high intensity training or racing, and I've written some, I've participated in some research on that. You could find those online as well. At rest, that balance of fat and glucose also varies, and it varies with the individual's lifestyle. In short, those who are more stressed oxidize less fat. Those who have more physical, biochemical, and mental emotional stress oxidize less fat. And a lot of this has to do with the stress hormone cortisol and of course the autonomic nervous system and so forth. For most runners, in this audience, I'm gathering, sub-max performance is a main focus because that's where our racing is. Although sprinters can benefit from sub-max performance and aerobic function and fat burning as well. But for most running, sub-max performance, improving that performance is a common missing link to better health and fitness. Developing sub-max performance is what MAF is all about. And we can develop maximal fat oxidation to improve athletic performance relatively easy. A key question is what intensity is best for a given individual? Of course, it varies, and I'm going to keep hitting this point because people need to take charge of their training, whether you have a coach or not. You're a participant in it. You're an active participant in training, just like a patient is an active participant in the process. You know, we don't just sit with a patient and say, here's what I want you to do, don't ask me any questions. We want people to understand what's going on because that removes a lot of stress, that mental emotional stress I mentioned earlier on. In the beginning of my career, I realized that running intensity affected so many physical, biochemical, and mental emotional factors. The gait, posture, sub-max and race performance, injuries, and many others. I assessed these and I became obsessed with measuring things, evaluating athletes. I assessed these to help determine the best intensity as measured by heart rate that would quickly reduce stress and improve both health and fitness. And I could sometimes get into a laboratory to gather data. I was still a clinician. And for most runners and other athletes, getting into a lab was not possible. So I had to find a training heart rate range in a different way that was just as accurate, a way that would personalize the process. And the result was a formula, the 180 formula, that leads to individualized MAF heart rate. And if you can put up that 180 formula, we'll see it's a two-step process. And this formula, as you see, it is the latest and greatest. I've been tweaking it. In the beginning, I tweaked it often as I obtained more data and realized that, well, this isn't quite right. In the last 20 years or so, the changes I made have been mostly in the explanation of it and in the self-assessment process. But it's a two-step process. First, you subtract your age from 180. And 180 minus your age has no meaning whatsoever. It's a step to the outcome that we're trying to find here. Second, we want to modify this 180 minus age number by choosing only one of the below categories that best apply to you. These are health and fitness factors that have been worked on for a long time and corresponded with my long evaluation of doing this by hand clinically with physical examinations in my clinic and then going out on the track, having athletes run at different heart rates to monitor their gaits and how they were feeling. Mostly I used gait. And I found that certain heart rates created a better gait and just a better situation. And one day I was lecturing, someone asked me how they could do that themselves. And I was a little embarrassed because I didn't have an answer. And I realized, hey, this must just be a mathematical problem that I need to solve. And that's the 180 formula. So you subtract your age from 180, you choose one category, A, B, C, D, that best applies to you. The key to this, just like every other clinical situation, you know, we're talking with a patient, we're a coach talking to our athlete, we're getting feedback from the athlete, we're helping the athlete understand things. If the athlete lies, if the patient lies, we're in trouble. So the key to this 180 formula is that you need to be honest. You need to find that category. And I've been amazed over the years, the reasons why people came up with such high training heart rates. You know, I ran track in high school, so I thought I would add 10. I have a positive attitude, so I should have a higher heart rate. No, sorry, that doesn't work. It's not how it works. So the resulting heart rate is the high end of your MAF training heart rate. The low end of that range is 10 beats below, and that's your MAF training range. So you don't want to exceed the MAF heart rate. And there's some examples there, and there's some other things we can maybe in the Q&A talk about if you have questions, but it's pretty straightforward for most people. So this MAF heart rate that I had people training at quickly led to improvements in submax performance. And I realized that, hey, here is another important evaluation, maybe one of the most important ones, which is called the MAF test. And this measures how fast one can run at their MAF heart rate. And it's an important test because it tells you, number one, the status of your aerobic system in real life. You know, how fast can you run at your MAF heart rate? And two, it serves as an ongoing monitoring test that we can use throughout the year. Human performance naturally progresses. We naturally get better. Of course, when we're 70 compared to when we're 20, we're not going to be as fast, obviously, but we can still at age 70 or at age 50 or 40 or 30 improve over where we're at now relative to that whole aging process. Human performance naturally progresses. We see it from birth. We just improve our health and fitness over the next 3 decades or more. Endurance athletes can improve significantly beyond this point, especially in ultramarathon events, because in part because they rely heavily on fat oxidation, which we can always improve. So the MAF test monitors human submax performance at one's MAF heart rate, which is also a interesting reflection, a predictor of race performance. As our submax performance improves, our race pace performance improves as well. As we train the body to be a better fat burner, and this is where food choices become a very important part, and training intensity, as we get going down the road using this system, we get faster at the same submax heart rate or the same MAF heart rate. This is the MAF test. And if you can put that chart up, which is a graph of, and I have a lot of these graphs, which you can see in various articles I've written through the years. This one is from that paper that I mentioned earlier. This is a male runner, seasoned runner who his first MAF test was 36 minutes for a 5K course, a flat 5K course that he would run on, and every month he redid his MAF heart rate, his MAF test. And except for a couple of points where he plateaued for 1 month, he gradually improved his time from 36 minutes to 27 minutes. This is a typical outcome following removal of lifestyle stresses, roadblocks that prevent an individual from making natural progress. This was my job as a clinician, as a coach, was to assess an athlete, figure out the lifestyle stressors that needed to be modified or eliminated in many cases. And heck, I didn't do much. I just helped the athlete remove these stresses, and they naturally progressed and became better athletes. The process is seen in beginners, in seasoned runners, in all sports, cycling and rowing, for example. We can measure power at the same MAF heart rate, and over time we see more power generated in a cyclist at the same MAF heart rate. The benefits are translated really in all sports, soccer, tennis, basketball. Harder to measure these improvements, but players now can perform at higher levels later in competition. They're able to do more at the same heart rate, or they're able to generate more power at the same at the same heart rate. Basically, they don't fatigue as much, say at the end of a match or later in a competition where fatigue typically determines the outcome of the event. So the MAF test it's a very important assessment tool. People want to learn how to do the MAF test. It's a relatively objective evaluation that monitors our training progress throughout the year. And I suggest that people perform the MAF test monthly, the same each time, the same track, the same running shoes, same time of day, and so forth. For seasoned athletes, I like the test to be 8K, 5 miles. And that gives us a chance to not only see that first segment of the test, which will be the fastest, but to also manage what I call sub-max fatigue. We have obviously max fatigue we see in the course of a race. We also have sub-max fatigue, and during the MAF test, after we warm up, each passing kilometer, each passing mile will usually be a little bit slower. And the reason for that is fatigue. We'll just call it general fatigue. And between the first and last mile, it becomes obvious, but you'll see each segment of the MAF test be slightly slower. Those with greater fat burning and endurance have little difference, and over time, as they develop their endurance, as they get better at submax performance, the differences from the first mile to the second to the third, fourth, and fifth become minimal. And this may be the reason why athletes who go through this fatigue less during a race. For example, they'll have a positive split in a marathon quite easily. A quick note about the 220 formula, which pretty much everyone in sports has heard of. It's traditionally been used for many, many years. It's one of the tools I used in the beginning of my career, only to find the outcome was not what I wanted long term as far as building both health and fitness. And that's what led me to look for a better approach. So I'll let you look at that 180 versus the 220 formula comparison in the article. But I want to mention something that's very important, and that's the concept of an aerobic base. My old friend Arthur Lydiard probably was the one who came up with this term that focused on a period of time when we build the aerobic system. And I found out long ago that training at one's MAF heart rate successfully required a period of exclusive training where you don't exceed the MAF heart rate. So runners avoid anaerobic training. They avoid competition for this period of time, this aerobic base period, which may last 3 months, 4, 5, 6 months or more, depending on the individual. And earlier, the graph I showed you was over a 12-month period. That's a little unusual, but this individual wanted to do that. His history dictated that, maybe that's what he really needed, and it turned out to be true. He performed extremely well after that. I should also mention that many seasoned runners perform personal best following this aerobic-only training period. In fact, I did a clinical study, which I think is touched on in that article. I used 229 seasoned athletes from my clinic over a period of, I forgot how long, over a period of a year. And these athletes strictly adhered to aerobic base training, not exceeding their aerobic heart rate, and 76% ran a personal best. In a seasoned athlete, they were obviously pretty excited. So to put this in perspective, if you can put that color chart up, here are some of the terms that you may be familiar with and how they all relate to the MAF heart rate. And you could see the green and the red on the spectrum of aerobic to anaerobic and exercise intensity as measured by heart rate and so forth. And so we have the MAF heart rate, which is in the same area as aerobic threshold, VT1, LT, and fat max. And then as we increase the intensity, and it doesn't take much intensity increase to get us to that anaerobic threshold, VT2, and so forth. And this should put it in perspective. And fat max is tied in with that. There's a chart on, there's a graph that shows fat max. If you can put that up, it's the last one. And here's a study that showed the difference between fat oxidation in people with a following a low carbohydrate diet who have adapted to a low carbohydrate diet. It can take weeks to months to adapt to a low carbohydrate diet compared to people who were maintained on their high carbohydrate diet. And obviously a significant difference in the amount of fat oxidation. And there are studies that show a lot more fat oxidation to a longer term adaptation, especially when we get into ketosis. Those grams per minute go up to, I think, 1.7 in some of the studies. So you can look at those. They're in that they're referenced in that paper that I have. So here's an important bottom line for me. Any lifestyle that promotes health and fitness will also improve sub-max performance over time. And really, you could use any training method you want, any dietary guidelines you want, deal with stress any way you want. If it works, if it's working for you, ongoing measurable improvement in sub-max performance will follow. But if we can't show that improvement in sub-max performance, likewise with health factors, then what you're doing isn't working. And so in a sense, MAF is an open system. You can apply it to anything and everything. You know, the latest trend on people going out and sprinting for 10 minutes, and that's the entire workout for the day. That game has come and gone. I've seen it come and gone since I was in high school. And it still comes and goes. And I don't know why people are buy into it, but the bottom line is it can't be sustained, number one, and number two, can't be sustained without falling apart. And number two, you do not see measurable improvement in submax performance. I've tried it. You know, I was schooled traditionally, and I figured, okay, all we have to do is train hard, train fast to race fast. And it's as simple as that. I wish it was as simple as that. Regarding the MAF test again, monitoring stress over time, really, really important. I can't emphasize that enough. If we improve over weeks and months, sometimes what we find is the MAF test suddenly worsens or plateaus for 2 months or more. That's a red flag. What it means is something in our lifestyle may be impairing further progress, and we need to find it and fix it. Again, if we have a clinician, we can get help. If we have a coach, we can get help finding the problem. And the problem can come from food, from training, again, any stress. As often happens, it's an accumulation of stress. That's the thing about stress, is that we can have 10 relatively minor stresses, but now they cause a big stress. So, and just a note, you saw some 1 month plateaus in that one chart a little while ago. Those are normal. I don't know why they occur. The test from month to month, you know, there's variability because we're all human. And just like going out for a race, sometimes we don't have a great day. But when it's consistently plateaued, and obviously if it worsens, it's a problem. I thought for many years, and maybe I still do, I don't know, it's very individual. I thought that when we hit a plateau, it means we've developed as much aerobic development as possible in the training cycle, and we therefore need to do something with higher intensity. And I'm not opposed to high intensity training. There's a place for it and there's a place to avoid it. But it's something that you know, we need to look at as individuals, whether that's their particular case or not. A note about the heart rate and the MAF heart rate and warming up. Warming up really is a method of increasing fat burning, and we can do that by running much slower or even walking. Take the heart rate at a very low level from where you start and gradually raise it for 12 to 15 minutes before hitting your MAF heart rate. And it'll increase fat burning more. It'll improve flexibility. It improves vital capacity, oxygenation, and so forth. And then you arrive at your MAF heart rate, you maintain your workout for a period of time until you're ready to start cooling down, which is just the opposite of a warm-up. 12 to 15 minutes of slowly bringing the heart rate down. You won't get down to where you started, but you'll come close. And that's called a cool down, and that's really the first stage of recovery, which recovery can be more important than the workout itself. I'm often asked, I'm trying to answer some questions before you ask them. I'm often asked about the MAF test as an assessment tool versus things like resting heart rate and heart rate variability. Resting heart rate is a wonderful regular measurement. Plotting that out as the weeks and months go by is really good. It's more acute of an evaluation, more of an acute evaluation than a monthly test, which MAF test is a monthly test. So from day to day, resting heart rate can go up and down with your stress. That's a nice, easy measurement we should all be taking. Heart rate variability, I've used it a lot. When I was in practice, I would send athletes to cardiologists to see heart rate variability in those who I felt needed to have that evaluation. Today, of course, we have apps. They're very good. I don't use one myself. I don't recommend them. They are very valuable. But you've got to be consistent with it, and you've got to understand how to evaluate, how to physically do that evaluation properly. so that you have good data to start with. So to a great extent, health and fitness is something we accomplish by balancing our lifestyle. We promote better neuromuscular function, we prevent injuries, we maintain hormone balance, we improve longevity. From a health standpoint, we improve our running careers. If we choose to compete, you know, when we're 90, there's no reason we can't do that and do it successfully. You know, the thing about age and age groups is that we are always competing against our peers, which makes it fun. And all along the way, you know, our goal is to reach our human potential. And so looking at these physical, biochemical, mental, emotional factors that can help us reach that human potential is really what MAF is all about, what my approach has been for many years, and in particular, increasing fat oxidation, which helps fuel the aerobic system. It also, you know, in building the aerobic muscle fibers, we support the anaerobic muscle fibers, which are void of circulation. That's why they're called white muscle fibers versus the red aerobic fibers. And of course, nutrition plays such a key role: macronutrient selection, micronutrient intake, phytonutrient intake, and so forth. These all influence fat oxidation to improve our long-term energy, maintain healthy levels of body fat, and improve overall health and fitness, helping us to reach our athletic potential. Thank you very much. I know that we are going to have some question and answers, and I'll turn it over to I don't know, Belinda or John.
That's it. Thank you very much, Dr. Maffetone. That was very interesting. So before we go to the questions and answers, we just hand over to Lindsay Perry, our comrades coach, so that he can just add some comments to the presentation. Lindsay?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of key messages that came through for me, and I figured there was going to be an enormous amount of information that was going to come in that hour, and thanks very much for that, Dr. Maffetone. But really, I think the loudest thing that came through for me there was the importance of individualization. And I've got one or two questions from myself that I will ask you towards the end of this. But individualization of program and treating people came out really loud for me. And the other thing which you really stressed, and I think it's something that's, I guess, obvious every time it's pointed out, but we do tend to forget it when, or in between it getting pointed out, and that is the fact that the average population is getting effectively unhealthier and unhealthier due to lifestyle and probably nutrition choices. And certainly, again, something that I could say that I've seen at road races, but you still think to yourself that your average 10K, half marathon, marathon, ultra marathon, and kind of as you go longer in your mind, you make the assumption that we get healthier, or we're getting into a healthier and healthier segments of the population. And that is not necessarily the case. And the other thing that jumped out at me, and it's something that I've had conversations with numerous people about, and in fact had a really cool conversation with 5 or 6 individuals about a week Sunday, and that is this decrease in depth that we see in the races. My father was an extremely competitive athlete in the from the early 70s to the early 80s, and there was one race in particular that it was glaringly obvious to me. I decided at around about the age of 36 that's it. I'm tired of being the slowest Parry in the house. I'm going to train for a marathon, and I'm going to beat my dad's time that he ran at 36. So we dug out his diary, and I went for a trained as hard as I possibly could for this race. On the day, I didn't have a particularly good run, and I ended up running a 3:04, and was pretty chuffed with myself nonetheless, because I'd managed to finish in the top 30 of the race. I can't remember the exact number, but it was upper 20s, 28, 29, something like that. So I phoned my dad and I was like, damn it, Dad, I didn't beat your time. Not by a long shot. He'd run 2:34. But what was significant was that my father had not finished in the top 50. So with a 2:34 in the early 1980s, at the age of 36, he had not finished in the top 50. And at this very same race, I'd finished in the top 30, running half an hour slower. So yeah, we certainly, there's certainly something that is getting in the way, and really lifestyle has a lot to do with it. We spend heaps more time in cars driving to and from work. We spend a lot of time eating on the move, or not eating at all, and then when we do eventually eat all the wrong things. So yeah, I think I don't have a ton to add on the training side of things. I mean, I think you summed it up brilliantly. Lydiate and you have, Lydiate, you, Greg McMillan, and now I've drawn a blank on the other person, but so I've got at least 3 of the 4 have been sort of the biggest influence on my coaching philosophy, which is to really train at sub-threshold levels for the vast majority of your training, to introduce intensity at the right time. And that's going to be where I kick off my questions for you, because knowing from reading your books, and there was one question in the Q&A which I'll answer on your behalf, and that is that you coached Mark Allen, and that Mark Allen came to you when he was looking for answers, when he was winning everything in triathlon there was to win except Ironman. And he came across you, and you then coached him successfully to all 6 of his titles. So yeah, in the Q&A, that question was asked. It is absolutely true. And I was very fortunate 2 weeks ago to also sit in a similar discussion as this, to hear kind of Mark's journey and how it wasn't just the training, although my favorite part of that story was the rudimentary heart rate monitors that you had people use in those days, effectively a homemade box about this big that was then had to be strapped on. But it wasn't just it. Yes, it was the training methodology and the Maf, as you've explained to us, but it really was sorting out his lifestyle choices, his nutrition, which also, although that's something that you worked quite hard on and fixed, he actually only nailed in Ironman at his final Ironman in 1995. We said that's the only time he ever finished Ironman without throwing up everything that he was trying to put in. But anyway, to take me to the question, because then he was also talking about this idea of knowing when to introduce the and maybe the question I'm asking is unfair because you kind of try to answer it, but at what point do you go, right, it is time to insert these some intensity into the workout, and what sort of proportion of that training week would you insert that or start to do that high intensity training?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to answer that. I could be more general, which I'll be. One thing I really like to do is help athletes read their bodies better. So for example, if they're getting faster and faster at the same MAF heart rate, at some point along the way, where in the beginning they complain, how could I run this slow? Mark did the same thing. And then as they go on, they say, you know, this is really a lot of fun. I'm getting faster. I'm able to, you know, now keep up with all my friends who are running at heart rates that are 15 beats higher than mine. And then they start complaining that they have to run too fast at the same MAF heart rate. So that puts things in really good perspective for them. And then if you say, okay, I'd like to see you jump into this 10K and let's see what you can do. And they run a personal best, having only done aerobic training. Boy, that puts things into perspective in a much different way. And then the question they often ask is, do I need to even do speed workout? Well, I've had plenty of athletes go through this exact you know, question answer process, and some of them say, well, I'm just going to start my racing season off my base. I'm not going to do anything. I did that with Mike Pigg, for example. And on Mike did aerobic training for months. And he said, well, I don't want to do anything anaerobic. I want to just keep doing what I'm doing, man. I'm just getting fit. Well, he jumped into a race, and in that first race, he beat Mark Allen. So do we need, as endurance athletes, do we need anaerobic training? Part of the answer to that is, what would you like to do? We're in this for fun. We're in this, you know, some of us make a living at running, but most of us are in it for fun. So what would you like to do? In the beginning, all they want to do is speed work. And we know where that got them. And now after they build a great aerobic system and they're running faster at the same heart rate, maybe they run a personal best in a race. Do they want to do speed work? Well, if they still want to have fun and do speed work, I don't have a problem with that. I was a track runner early in my life, and I love the track. And but some people are really turned off by the track or the idea of having to do something like a race. They don't mind racing, but to do that without the competition. So it depends on the person, but what's important for everybody is that they build that aerobic system and be able to quantify it, be able to measure the improvements. And of course, you can then get to the point where you say, well, I've improved my MAF pace. My race season is going to start. If I start doing high intensity training, will that make me plateau from a submax performance standpoint? And the answer is, it will at some point. It may take a week or 2 or 3, which is about the max benefit you get from intensity training, a period of 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it depends on the individual and what they want to do.
Cool. And I had a couple of questions lined up, but there's some good ones in the Q&A. So I'm not going to hog all of your time, but I do have one more question, and that is really about the effect of environmental conditions, and particularly in older athletes, talking 50+ athletes. And as we get older, our ability to thermoregulate does decrease. So if you're working with older athletes, and this is something that I'm seeing a lot in the States, where you've got very hot, very humid places, and what impact that would would have, and how do you adjust for it? Because if we using the Maf method, what I often see is I struggle to see improvements, let me put it that way, in the hot, humid. And then, of course, we do persevere with months of plateau, but as soon as it cools down, we suddenly see these enormous benefits. Are there some workarounds besides trying to just control that body temperature?
Yeah, for sure. You will see a suspension of submax progress when the weather's bad. My clinic was in the New York City suburbs, and in the Northeast in August in particular, the weather can be really terrible. We not only have the high temperatures, but we have the high humidity. We have a lot of low barometric pressure, which reduces oxygen uptake, so that gets thrown in there. And what my response to that was, for athletes who lived in that area, was to cut their training down. Sometimes I would cut their training down by 50%, and that would start their progress again, even in the middle of August.
Okay.
So, but that's an example of stress, slowing down progress, and you have to figure out how to deal with that stress. Do you say, I got to go through all my other stresses in life and get rid of them? Can I really do that? Can you leave your family, quit your job, move to Colorado? Some people have done that. But it's a good example of stress, and no matter what your age, it does the same thing. It'll do the same thing in an older person, but in my experience, not significantly if that older person is healthy. The problem, the confusion about COVID-19 and older people being more vulnerable, older people are not more vulnerable. People who have comorbidities and who have poor health, which happens to be older people, are the ones that are susceptible. So, a lot of times the people in their 60s and even 50s, 60s, 70s say, well, I can't use this heart rate formula because I can't even run. Well, that's not my fault. You need to get healthier and more fit. And they say, well, my testosterone is low. I need to take testosterone. Well, no, you need to get healthy. If you remove your cortisol, high cortisol, your testosterone may come up, and blah, blah, blah. So let's not use the technique. Let's not blame the weather. Let's not do anything but say, hey, what can I do for my situation at this time? And when people are honest and people are dedicated and disciplined, it happens.
Great. Right, Belinda, would you like to then run through? There's some good questions in there, so you take over, and I look forward to hearing those answers. Pleasure.
The first one that I think is the one like burning in the top of my mind. Watching London Marathon as well on Sunday with Eliud Kipchoge, and I was quite surprised at how soon into the race Eliud Kipchoge started taking on carbohydrates. So linking that to one of the questions where, someone has asked, do you think that ultimately a fat-adapted athlete would outperform a carb-adapted athlete at world-class level over, say, the marathon distance? Because the current thinking is that at that distance, you're burning purely carbs. So somebody with the same level, same talent, would they outrun Eliud Kipchoge if they were fat-adapted?
Belinda, I'm missing every other word. I tried getting closer, but I couldn't hear it. But I got the gist of it, I think, or part of it, which is taking carbohydrate during a race. Is that the focus of that
so
question?
The question is somebody that's fat adapted versus carb adapted, who is going to come out tops at a world?
Well, if you have two exactly identical world-class runners running a marathon, the fat adapted one will hypothetically come out ahead because the fat adapted athlete will not use up his or her glycogen stores along the way, but the carbohydrate adapted athlete will, and that carbohydrate adapted athlete will have to consume a lot more carbohydrate to try to make up for that difference, which is really difficult. Whereas the fat adapted athlete will not have to consume much carbohydrate, if any, because you're burning fat stores, and you know, a lean athlete has enough fat stores to run several marathons. So that's not a problem. And just a note, the need to take more carbohydrate during a race, no matter what the distance, when you're not fat adapted, is a big factor, because those carbohydrates cause GI upset, and GI upset is a common cause of dropping out of a race, having a poor performance, and some of these GI upsets are quite serious. And if you want to, if that's a problem you've had and you want to avoid it, figure out how to do your best race without having to consume so much carbohydrate.
Okay, thank you. Let us see. There were some other questions here. So there's a question about your Maf training method. So someone's been on your training method for the past year and subtracted 5 because of the flu that he caught twice a year. And for at least 1 year, this didn't happen. He's asking, should he reevaluate his Maf heart rate now or wait? How long do you wait to reevaluate your Maf heart rate?
Yeah, so I think he's asking about, can we change the 180 formula because now we're healthy, where before we were less healthy, so we were in a different category. Yes, if you've improved your health over a year or more, the fact that you're a year older is almost irrelevant, because you're physiologically now younger. So you can go back and say, okay, I'm no longer in this category where I get 2 colds and flu a year. I don't get sick anymore. I'm going to adjust my heart rate up 5 beats. Yes, you can do that. However, you need to keep monitoring your Maf test, because if that is too much for you, the first time you'll know is when your Maf test starts to slow down. So sure, that's possible to make that change, but keep monitoring the Maf heart rate to take the guesswork away.
Thank you. So similar question. So where he was training his 3 to 4 days a week for 6 months, and his results were inconsistent until he actually started running every day. And after a month, he says at some point doing 90 minutes a day, he did see an improvement in his Maf test. And he says, is this normal, or is it perhaps sleeping or eating habits that could have caused the inconsistencies?
When you see inconsistency, when you don't see improvement, like from the beginning, you just don't see improvement, you should always think of food, and you should always think, have I got the right one? Have I done the 180 formula properly? Do I have the right Maf heart rate? And it's almost always one of those two things. Sometimes it's both. There are people, again, it's very individual. There are people who need a certain training volume to promote improved aerobic benefits. And so sometimes we see that. But I would say in my career, when I've had to adjust volume, which is something I often do, 90% of the time it's lowering the volume that's required to create a positive change. Hardly ever do we have to, most people run more than they need to.
Thanks. Question from Lance. He says, if low carbohydrate diet improves fat oxidation and VO2 max, why do athletes hit the wall sooner? And would distance be a factor?
I'm not sure what he means. Does he mean that fat adapted athletes hit the wall sooner? that would imply that they're not fat adapted. Carbohydrate adapted people tend to hit the wall sooner because they run out of glycogen. They run out of glycogen stores, or their blood sugar gets low and they don't have the ability to bring it back up, whatever the case, whatever the reason for hitting the wall.
Okay. Question about macronutrients. So you mentioned the balance of macronutrients are quite individual. And how does one determine what a person's correct as opposed to preferred mix of macronutrients is?
Don't know. You know, I've got a case study I published a couple of years ago of a professional triathlete who just turned her performance around dramatically by changing her carbohydrate intake from about, I don't remember exactly what it was, from about 80% carbohydrates to about 10% carbohydrates, something like that. And then fat mostly took the place of the carbohydrates. So that's a pretty, what many would consider a pretty dramatic shift. And once she adapted, which took 3 months maybe, her performances were spectacular. So, but when we talk about low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate, we're talking about 50 grams of carbohydrate, 30 of which or 20 of which would be fiber, so we wouldn't count them because we're not absorbing that carbohydrate. But 50 grams would bring you down into ketosis, and that would be a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And if you get up to 60 and 70 grams of carbohydrate, that's still considered a low carbohydrate diet. The key is, and people don't understand this, but the key is we have to balance our fat and carbohydrate. So if we're having a high carbohydrate diet, we have a low fat diet. If we reduce our carbohydrates, we have to bring up our fat. Otherwise, we go into caloric deficiency, and protein stays the same, but it's like a seesaw. We bring our carbohydrates down, we better increase our fat. And then as we adapt, like the article that I think I just posted on my website last week, or maybe this week, as we adapt and our metabolism improves, our total caloric intake starts to reduce. And we can reduce our even, I'm talking about athletes too, we can reduce our caloric intake by 10, 20, 30% sometimes, 40% sometimes, and still have the same energy, still have high health, still perform really well because we're fat adapted.
Okay, thank you. I have a question relating to famous athletes like Mark Allen, Tim DeBoer, Mike Pigg, where you help them. How did you help them sort the nutrition? And were they always low carb? And did you ever use carbo loading with these athletes? And was it necessary?
The way I begin helping people change their diet is by looking at what they're eating now. And I would do a diet analysis and I say, here's what you're eating now. And you have all these symptoms, which I am associating many of them to the way you're eating. So here's what, to get rid of those symptoms, here's what I'd like to do is change your diet. So you lower your carbohydrate, you raise your fat, you do whatever. It's really a trial. Let's try this. You know, that's why they call it being in practice. We're practicing on our patients. Let's see how you perform eating this way. It's like having I hate to use this analogy. It's like having a rat in a laboratory, you know, running on the wheel. You do something, you throw them on the wheel, you look at them, you take them out and you do whatever you do to them. And then that's what we do with athletes. And you learn to go through that process a lot quicker over time. But that's how I would begin with someone like Mark. I did a diet analysis with Mike. I did a dietary analysis. I said, here's what you're doing. Here is what you're complaining about. Here are your goals. And so to reach those goals and get rid of these abnormal signs and symptoms, I suggest making these changes. We make those changes. And then over the weeks, we modify them bit by bit. But what happens is they notice that they can make the modifications to really tweak their diet. You know, all animals on Earth know how to eat except for humans. And we need to get back that instinct, those intuitions, to learn how to eat. And instead, what humans do is they eat what the latest TV commercial said they should be eating, or the sign on the bus, the ad on the highway sign. We have this problem that we're told what to eat by companies that make products, and that's shameful. It's how we got into the mess we're in now. But working one-on-one with an athlete was some trial and error, some logic, common sense. The first thing everyone should do is get rid of the junk food, because there's no place for junk food in anyone's diet. And that doesn't mean we can't use carbohydrate supplement during a race. But the first thing you do is you become fat adapted better than you are now. And now you need less carbohydrate supplementation during the race. And then you can experiment in training to see which kind of carbohydrate will help you most during training, which will then help you most during the race. And the best suggestion there is to use monosaccharides, which don't require digestion, like fruit juice and honey.
Okay. We're getting a few questions about fat oxidation that uses more oxygen. So physiologically, the oxygen cost of burning fat is higher than burning carbs. So does being fat adapted with higher energy yield come at the cost of decreased VO2 max? And how does this translate to performance?
That's an interesting question. I've seen, I think there are studies that show that fat adapted athletes do not have a higher VO2 max. And the fact is, I don't care. Because if you're performing better, I don't care what your VO2 max is. I think VO2 max is a very important measure, but I think it's one of those things that people like to talk about, and most of those people have never had their VO2 max tested. And there's plenty of great athletes who didn't have a great VO2 max, but were great performers. So what does that all mean? I think we need to put all of those numbers that we get from a laboratory, and laboratory numbers are different than what we see in an athlete on race day. But all those numbers, I think, need to be correlated differently today than we have in the past, where we've relied on one number like VO2 max. We need to combine that with the numbers I showed you on that chart. We need to combine that with RER. What's your RER at a given heart rate? What is your aerobic threshold? What is your, put all of those together, and then we can make more objective sense out of them rather than focusing on VO2 max.
Okay, so from your books, it's clear you don't embrace stretching at all. What other recovery modalities do you then use or advocate?
Well, I recommend a warm-up to increase flexibility. A warm-up will, an active warm-up will increase flexibility as much as stretching without the risk. Stretching comes with risks because people don't do it properly, number one, and endurance athletes don't really need it in my experience. If you're a gymnast, if you're doing ballet, if you're a track and field athlete, you might need more flexibility than you get from an active warm-up, and then you might have to do some stretching, but only it's done after an active warm-up. The cool down is another very important part that, as I mentioned, is the first stage of recovery, and that's an essential part of the workout that we can't skip over like most people do.
Linda, I'm going to come in here and just, we come to the end of our time, and I just want to thank you for hosting the session. Thanks, Lindsay, for your insight and input. And Dr. Maffetone, you don't have access to my WhatsApp messages that are coming through, but the number of people that's saying, wow, I've got a lot to learn and I need to go and look into this. And we haven't, unfortunately, been able to get through all the questions. So can you give us your website where people can perhaps go and look for those answers?
Sure. My health and fitness website is philmaffetone.com. And there are probably over 400 articles on there. They're all free. There's a free ebook that describes the method overall. There's a lot of material on running and competitive sports, heart rate monitoring, food and nutrition, and all the things we talked about today.
Well, brilliant. No ways we were ever going to cover it in an hour and a half, and I'm sure people can go through that website and learn an awful amount from your tremendous experience. As a clinician, I found it fascinating. I'm certainly going to relook some of the advice I give and some of the advice I follow. So thank you very much for your time, for preparing for this, and we really do appreciate it. We've learned a tremendous amount. So thanks for your work and keep it up.
Thank you, John, and Melinda and Lindsay and everyone who showed up here.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much. And to all of you who've followed us this evening, we're carrying on the theme next week, and that is a talk by Dr. Georgia Torres on exercise is medicine. So really to pick up on the theme that we started today is really to look at how we should be introducing exercise as a prescription as clinicians in everything we do. So don't miss that next week on the 14th of October at the same time. And just as we wrap up, again, a big thank you to Asina Lita for their support of these webinars, to our SASMA friends and colleagues for joining this and promoting our webinars as well. And we look forward to bringing you some interesting ones in the coming month before the academic year wraps up. So have a good evening. Thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.